Why did the room always go quiet when she picked up the scissors? Katherine Morgan had been cutting hair at Fort Rainier for 3 years, and she had never quite gotten used to the strange mix of tension and intimacy that came with her job. The little salon smelled faintly of aftershave and clinical shampoo, its fluorescent lights casting everyone, privates and colonels alike, into the same washed-out glow. It was a place where soldiers came to feel human for 20 minutes at a time before returning to the business of preparing for the world's worst days. To most people, Katherine was just that, an ordinary woman with a warm smile and an easy laugh, someone who asked about your kids, remembered their names, and always seemed to know when to talk and when to stay quiet. But if anyone had been watching her closely, really watching, they might have noticed how her hazel eyes always seemed to be measuring things. Doors, angles, people. They might have noticed that her hands, though delicate, moved with a precision that belonged to someone who had done far more with them than cut hair. This morning, like every morning, she stood at her station at exactly 0730. "Morning, Sergeant Donovan," she said as Mike Donovan pushed through the glass door, the bell overhead giving its cheerful little chime. "Morning, Kate," he said, the corners of his mouth turning up. He was built like a tank, a man who could probably bench press her whole chair, but the way his face lit up when she remembered his daughter's name never failed to soften him. "Got time for me? Big video call tonight." "Your daughter?" Katherine asked, draping the black cape around his shoulders with practiced precision. "She just turned 8 last month." "Right 8, Katherine said, smiling faintly as she combed through his hair. "Feels like last week she was still learning to walk, doesn't it?" Donovan chuckled. "Tell me about it." The scissors moved in their rhythmic dance, the sound almost meditative. To anyone else, this was a simple moment, a soldier getting his hair trimmed before a call home. To Katherine, it was another piece in a puzzle she had been assembling silently for 3 years. She knew which haircut patterns meant which mission cycles, which soldiers requested trims just before deploying, which ones came in after bad news. She knew the quiet ones, the anxious ones, the ones who always asked for high-end type before anything serious. The door swung open again, and the energy in the room shifted. 4 men walked in, filling the small space with a presence that was almost physical. Even in standard-issue T-shirts, they carried themselves with the calm, deliberate confidence of men who had moved through places where every shadow might hold an ambush. "SEAL Team 6 Alpha." Katherine's eyes flicked up, her hands never pausing in their rhythm. "Morning, gentlemen," she said lightly. "Dream Team needs a trim before the big day." Lieutenant Jack Stevens led the way, all square jaw and quiet intensity, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from the idea of military leadership. Behind him was Chief Petty Officer Derek Wilson, stockier, older, the weathered lines of his face telling stories he'd never share. Petty Officer Raphael Mendes followed, dark eyes always moving, scanning like a man who could never fully put down the burden of vigilance. And last was Henry Jang, their intelligence specialist, lean and sharp-eyed, as if he were perpetually halfway through solving a puzzle no one else could see. "If you can fit us in," Stevens said with a faint Carolina drawl, "we're up at 500 tomorrow." "For you guys, always," Katherine replied, brushing the last loose hairs from Donovan's neck. The SEALs settled into the waiting area. They looked relaxed, but Katherine knew better. Even at rest, their bodies were coiled springs, ready to react. It was something she recognized because it was something she understood. "Afghanistan again?" she asked casually, her tone light as she started on Stevens' cut. He shrugged. "Intel gathering should be routine." Nothing was ever routine with SEAL Team 6, and everyone in the room knew it. But they maintained the fiction of normalcy. That was another ritual of military life, and Katherine played her part with the same precision she used on Stevens' fade. She draped the cape over his broad shoulders and couldn't help but notice the scar along his collarbone, still pink. A mission that would never appear in public records. The usual, she asked. Yes, ma'am. Their eyes met briefly in the mirror, and for a moment she allowed herself to see him, not as a customer, not as a soldier, but as a man carrying the weight of other men's lives on his shoulders. Then he said two words that stopped her hands mid-motion. Crimson Eagle. The pause was almost imperceptible, less than a second, but inside Catherine's chest, something old and buried shifted. Crimson Eagle. The code name fell like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples through memories she had worked very hard to drown. Moscow, 1986. The Metropole Hotel. The smell of gunpowder and snow. A man falling silently from a window, his body swallowed by the night below. Sounds intense, she said evenly, resuming the cut as if nothing had happened. He chuckled softly, above my pay grade. She smiled faintly in the mirror, but inside her pulse was hammering. Crimson Eagle was supposed to be gone, burned, buried, locked in a vault that no longer existed. Yet here it was again. By the time she finished with Stevens, her mind was no longer in the salon. It was cataloging, cross-referencing, assembling pieces. As Wilson settled into her chair, she forced her hands to stay steady. This was the team she had come to know, quietly, over 3 years. She knew Wilson was getting married after this deployment. She knew Mendes had 2 boys who idolized him, a 3rd child on the way. She knew Jang had grown up on bases, spoke 6 languages, and carried the quiet pride of a man who had made it through Bud S on sheer intellect and stubbornness. They were more than soldiers to her now, they were good men. And if someone had resurrected Crimson Eagle, they were walking into something much darker than routine intel gathering. When they left the shop, Stevens hung back just a moment, waiting until the others stepped outside. If anything happens to us out there, he said quietly, there's an envelope in my quarters. It's addressed to you. Her breath caught. Special operators didn't talk like that unless they sensed something off. Nothing going to happen, she said too quickly. Right, Stevens said with a humorless half-smile, and then he was gone. When the glass door closed behind them, Katherine stood in the silence of her little salon, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. She stared at the empty chairs, her reflection in the mirror, and felt the weight of the decision already forming. She closed the salon early, citing a headache. In her quarters that night, Katherine knelt by her bed and removed a section of baseboard that looked ordinary to anyone else. Behind it was a satellite phone she had promised herself she would never use. Her fingers hesitated over the keypad. Once she made this call, there was no going back. Then she dialed from memory. 4 rings. Bookstore, a gruff voice answered. I need to speak with the proprietor, Katherine said softly, about a first edition of Winter Palace. 30 seconds of silence. Then, hello, ghost. The voice was older, raspier than she remembered, but unmistakable. Crimson Eagle is active, Katherine said, and heard the silence on the other end deepen. Ghost, Harrison repeated, as if tasting the name he hadn't spoken in years. I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again. Katherine closed her eyes, the old name scraping over her like broken glass. It was Katherine Morgan he was speaking to now. Crimson Eagle is active, she said flatly. SEAL Team 6 is deploying under that code name at 500 tomorrow. Afghanistan. Intel gathering. Silence stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice had hardened. That's not possible. The files were destroyed. The operation was buried for good reason. Apparently not deep enough. There was a soft exhale on the other end, a sound she had heard before every mission where he knew he was about to ask her to do something that would haunt her forever. Who else knows? He asked. Right now, just me, but if that team gets compromised. They will, Harrison interrupted quietly. If someone resurrected Crimson Eagle, they're not doing it for nostalgia. They're baiting a trap. The old clarity, The cold focus she had once lived by began threading its way back into her mind. The Katherine who cut hair had no place here. "What's my play?" she asked. "That depends on whether you're still out, or whether you're ready to be ghost again." Her chest tightened. For 7 years she had been building a life on the idea that Ghost was gone, that she had buried Elizabeth Reynolds the day she walked away from Langley. But now 4 men, good men, men who sat in her chair every 3 weeks and told her about their families, were walking into the kind of nightmare she used to be sent to create. "You still have the kit?" Harrison asked, as though he already knew the answer. "Yes." "Phoenix," he said. "Contingency site is still active. Access code 519,643,817. You'll find everything you need." "You knew this day would come," she said softly. Harrison's dry chuckle came across the line. "I never bet against fate, and fate has a habit of calling in its debts." The line went dead. Katherine sat in the stillness of her quarters for a long time. The desert wind rattled the blinds softly, the only sound besides her own heartbeat. If she left tonight, there was no coming back. Not to this base, not to this life, not to Katherine Morgan. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo on the dresser, not of family, not of friends, but of a quiet sunrise over the Arizona desert. She had taken it the first month she arrived. It was her reminder that there were still beautiful things in the world. She stood, moved to the hidden compartment under her bed, and opened it. Inside lay the things she had promised herself she would never need again. A custom-built sniper rifle, a Glock with a threaded barrel, cash in 3 currencies, passports for identities she hadn't worn in years. Her hands moved automatically, checking each item, assembling, loading. By the time she was finished, Katherine Morgan no longer existed. Elizabeth Reynolds, call sign Ghost, stood in her place. Fort Rainier slept uneasily that night. Out on the tarmac, C-130s waited under floodlights for their next missions. Inside the barracks, men and women dreamed restless dreams about sand and dust and violence. Ghost sat alone in her Jeep outside the wire, watching the base shrink in her rearview mirror. For a brief moment, doubt clawed at her. She could still turn back, close the compartment, pretend she had never heard those words. But the image of Stephen's half-smile wouldn't leave her. The memory of Mendes crossing himself when he mentioned being back for his daughter's birth. No, she couldn't let them be sacrificed. The desert road stretched out ahead of her, black ribbon under a moonless sky. She drove fast, the headlights carving narrow tunnels through the night. By dawn, she was in Phoenix. The warehouse looked exactly as Harrison had promised, nondescript, abandoned, a place no one would glance at twice. Inside, dust covered everything except for one electrical panel that was just a little too clean. Her handprint triggered the hidden mechanism. The panel slid aside, revealing a steel elevator that hummed softly as it descended 60 feet underground. When the doors opened, she felt her chest tighten. It was like stepping into the past. Weapons racks gleamed under soft lights. Communications gear blinked quietly, ready to be activated. There was even a small aircraft hangar with a C-130 Hercules parked inside, its matte paint job betraying upgrades designed for stealth. On the central table lay an envelope with her name. Elizabeth. Inside was a single note in Harrison's tight handwriting. Ghost, if you're here, the Phoenix contingency is active. Everything here is untraceable. Camel still honors his debt from Tehran, 89. The C-130 has range for Afghanistan with 1 refuel stop. Remember Moscow. Sometimes the obvious path is the one they least expect. For the first time in years, she almost smiled. She moved through the facility quickly, selecting what she needed. Tactical armor, night vision, electronic warfare devices that no conventional rescue team would think to bring. The kind of gear that let one person do the work of 10. An hour later, the aircraft was prepped, the engines warming. She strapped in as the hangar doors groaned open. For a moment, she let her eyes close. The last time she had sat in a jump seat like this, she had sworn it would be the last time, sworn she would never again be the weapon someone else pointed. But this time was different. This time the mission was hers. At 2:37 a.m., halfway across the desert sky, the alert came. Her military-issued device buzzed violently against her chest. She pulled it out, already dreading what it would say. Security Level Alpha. Her blood went cold. Level Alpha meant only one thing: American personnel killed or captured in the field. She diverted to the nearest strip that could take the Hercules and taxied to a stop. She had to know before she crossed the border. Back at Fort Rainier, chaos reigned. She moved through the administration building unseen, just another support staffer refilling coffee cups. It was almost funny how easily the old habits came back, staying invisible in plain sight, blending until she was part of the furniture. Inside the command room, Colonel Peterson stood at the head of the table, his face grim. "Satellite confirmation," he barked. "Yes, sir," Major Winters replied. SEAL Team 6 Alpha was ambushed at the primary insertion point. 4 men confirmed captured, currently being held at a compound northeast of the original target. Ghost's heart pounded, but her hand stayed steady as she aligned sugar packets on the counter. "They were waiting," Winters added. 50 fighters heavily armed, this wasn't random. "Extraction. Minimal. Nearest QRF is 6 hours away. Any helicopter approach would be a shooting gallery." "And the hostiles' intentions?" Winters hesitated, then tapped a screen. "Intercepted communications indicate public execution at dawn. They're setting up broadcast equipment." A chill passed through the room. Dawn in Afghanistan was less than 4 hours away. Ghost didn't wait to hear the rest. She had heard enough. The trap had sprung. She slipped out through the side entrance before anyone noticed her absence, mind already racing. If they executed Stevens, Wilson, Mendes, Jang on live broadcast, the outcry would be nuclear. And that was exactly what Foster wanted. She needed to get there before dawn. And for that, she would have to be faster than she had ever been before. What do you do when you have less than 4 hours to save 4 men from certain death? Ghost didn't waste time asking herself if it was possible. That question didn't matter. She moved with cold efficiency, as if years of civilian life had been a dream and she had just woken up. By the time the rest of the base was fully mobilizing, she was already back in her Jeep, tearing through the desert toward the airfield where her C-130 waited with engines still cooling from the earlier landing. The night felt sharper now, the air thinner, every star overhead like a pinprick through black velvet. Her mind worked at the same speed as her hands as she climbed back into the aircraft and activated the secure satellite link. "Harrison." "You saw the alert," his voice was tight. "Yes, they've been taken alive. Public execution at dawn." A long silence, then softly, "They want you." "I know. This isn't just retaliation, Ghost. This is bait. Foster is counting on you going after them." "Then he's right. You're walking into an ambush." She checked the straps on her vest, snapped a magazine into her rifle. "I've walked into worse." "Not alone." She didn't answer. "Listen to me," Harrison said, urgency creeping into his usually calm tone. "If you go in there as one person against 50 trained fighters, you don't come out." "That's not the plan," she said, glancing at the tablet displaying satellite imagery that Harrison had pushed to her earlier. "I'm not going through them. I'm going around them." A pause, then a note of grudging respect in his voice. "Psychological warfare." "Exactly. I don't need them all dead. I just need them scared, confused, and looking the wrong way." She could almost hear him smile faintly. There she is. Ghost didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew what it meant when she started talking like this. Half a world away, the seals knelt in a dirt courtyard, hands bound behind their backs, faces bloodied but unbroken. The compound smelled of dust, sweat, and oil, a mixture of diesel generators, old weapons, and human fear. Stevens tried not to show pain as the broken bone in his arm throbbed with each breath. Wilson sat to his left, silent, conserving energy. Mendes, ever the talker, murmured under his breath, half prayer, half reassurance. Jang kept his eyes open, watching every detail, counting guards, nodding positions. His mind was running the same math as Ghost's thousands of miles away. "This was a setup," Wilson said finally, his voice quiet. Stevens nodded. "Someone fed them our route." "They're going to make it a show," Mendes muttered. Stevens didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all knew. He glanced toward the nearest guard, who met his look with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. SEALs had reputations that preceded them. Hard men, dangerous men, men who didn't break easily. But this wasn't a battlefield they could win by force. Not tied up, not surrounded by dozens of rifles. They needed a miracle. The miracle was already coming. By the time the Hercules touched down on a dusty, forgotten airstrip in Pakistan's tribal belt, Ghost's plan was taking shape. She was met by Camel's men, lean, hard-eyed Afghans with AKs slung over their shoulders, men who had fought both for and against the Americans over the years, but who owed their loyalty now to Camel, and to a debt that went back to Tehran. "Everything you asked for," said the youngest of them, handing her a key to a battered Toyota Hilux that looked like it had been through 3 wars. In the back was the package she had requested: small, precise tools of terror, remote sound projectors, smoke devices, jammers, enough to turn a quiet night into a nightmare. "Kazmi reinforced his northern perimeter after he got word of the capture," the man added. 57 fighters now, snipers on the ridges." Ghost just nodded. 5 more men barely changed the math. The drive into Afghanistan took 3 hours through switchback mountain roads that would have terrified a lesser driver. Ghost kept the Hilux steady, her hands calm on the wheel even as her muscles protested the hours of punishment. By dawn, she was in position. She set up on a ridge overlooking the compound from the southwest, the direction no sane planner would ever choose to approach. The terrain was almost vertical, exposed, suicidal, which made it perfect. Through her high-powered scope, she watched the enemy compound wake up. Guards moved with discipline, not like amateurs. Their patrol patterns were precise, their fields of fire overlapping. Whoever had set up this perimeter knew what they were doing. She scanned until she found them, 4 men kneeling in the courtyard. Stevens, Wilson, Mendes, Jang. Alive. Relief hit her like a punch, sharp enough to make her close her eyes for a second. Then she pushed it down. Relief was dangerous. It made you slow. She forced herself to look again, this time clinically. Stevens' arm was broken, but he was alert, his posture still commanding despite the pain. Wilson's gaze was watchful, his jaw set. Mendes's mouth moved in constant, quiet motion. Jang's expression was carved from stone. Good, they were still fighting. She observed for 6 hours, documenting guard rotations, counting weapons, nodding where Kazmi himself appeared, always in command, always confident, occasionally taking calls on a satellite phone. By the time the sun began to set, Ghost had a complete picture of the battlefield. And a plan. She started her descent after dark. The western slope was nearly vertical, more cliff than hill. She moved slow, deliberate, every muscle protesting. The harness cut into her shoulders, the rope biting into her gloves, but she kept going. 2 hours later, she was within 90 meters of the compound wall. One by one, she began planting devices. Sonic projectors in blind spots, smoke charges where the wind would carry them just right, electronic warfare modules close enough to scramble communications but not so close as to alert them prematurely. Every step a risk, every movement timed between patrol passes, her body pressed against cool stone while fighters walked past just meters away. By midnight, the perimeter was seated. Ghost took her position on a small rise just far enough from the wall to give her a clear shot into the compound. She settled behind her rifle, checked her watch. 5 hours to dawn. 5 hours until execution. And then she waited. The night stretched, silent and endless. She breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the stillness soak into her bones. This was the part most operators hated, the waiting. Ghost welcomed it. It reminded her of Moscow, of Berlin, of places where she had lain still for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the single perfect moment. Her mind stayed calm, but somewhere deep down, Katherine Morgan stirred. That part of her whispered that she didn't have to do this, that she could walk away, disappear again, let the world burn without her. But Ghost knew better. Some debts can't be outrun. At 100, she triggered the first jammer. Somewhere in the compound, a frustrated guard tapped a radio, shook it, tried again. Phase 1 had begun. What does fear sound like at 2 in the morning? Tonight, it sounded like static and garbled voices over radios. Ghost watched through her night scope as the first hints of confusion rippled through the compound. Guards tapped their headsets, adjusted antennas, cursed in Dari and Pashto. The intermittent jamming she had triggered made every message sound half-broken, like ghosts whispering in the wires. Perfect. She let the frustration build for 15 minutes before moving to Phase 2. A thumb pressed a trigger on her remote. 3 sonic projectors hidden on the northern ridgeline came alive at once, producing the unmistakable rattle of distant gunfire, American gunfire. The reaction was immediate. Kazmi's men snapped to alert, several rushing to reinforce the northern wall. Snipers rotated toward the phantom contact. Their shouts overlapped as they tried to coordinate, but the jamming kept their orders fractured, distorted, delayed. Ghost waited, patient as stone. She could feel her heartbeat slow, every breath measured. When the tension was just right, she triggered Phase 3. A false radar signature generated by her electronic warfare module, mimicking a small strike team approaching from the east. Through her scope, she watched chaos take hold. Kazmi himself stormed into the courtyard, shouting orders. His men split, half reinforcing the north, another group pulling to the eastern wall. The western approach, her approach, was now thinly guarded. Ghost shifted her rifle, centered her crosshairs on the northwestern tower and squeezed. The suppressed Barrett barked once, the recoil rolling through her shoulder like a heartbeat. The guard in the tower crumpled without a sound. She shifted, fired again, then again, methodically moving across the perimeter. 7 guards fell in 20 minutes, each chosen for their isolation, each death unnoticed in the mounting confusion. By 2:30, the compound was primed. Ghost triggered the smoke charges. Thick plumes of colored vapor erupted along the eastern wall, curling upward into eerie shapes under the moonlight. Kazmi's men fired blindly into the haze, convinced the attack was coming from that direction. Some shouted that the smoke was chemical. Others broke formation, panicking. Fear was contagious. Ghost moved. She scaled the western wall in less than a minute, her gloves biting into the rough stone. When she dropped down inside the outer courtyard, she was no longer a woman with a rifle. She was something else, silent, invisible, lethal. She switched to her MP5 SD, close quarters now. A lone guard rounded the corner, weapon half raised. 2 suppressed shots dropped him where he stood. Ghost dragged his body into the shadows before his partner returned on patrol. Then she was moving again. The compound had become a labyrinth of running men, shouting voices, and half-understood orders. Each time Ghost eliminated a fighter, she did so cleanly, quietly, a blade across a throat, a single suppressed shot, and left the body where it would be found just soon enough to spread panic. She became the story they had been told about her. A shadow, a myth. By 300, the outer courtyard was clear. Ghost took a moment to breathe, crouching in darkness, her chest rising and falling with controlled rhythm. Then she crept toward the inner courtyard. The seals were still there, tied to the post, but now only 6 guards remained in the immediate area. Most had been drawn north and east by the phantom attack. Ghost lay prone behind a low wall, studying their positions. 1, 2, 3. Her rifle cracked softly 3 times. 3 guards down before the others realized what was happening. She was already moving when they returned fire, the MP5 barking in 3-round bursts. 12 seconds later, the courtyard was silent. Ghost rose from behind the low wall, crossing to the post where the seals knelt. Stephen's eyes widened as she approached, recognition dawning despite the tactical gear and rifle. "Katherine," he rasped. "Not anymore," she said, cutting his restraints with a combat knife. Wilson blinked at her. "Who the hell are you really?" Ghost didn't look up from the knots she was cutting. "Someone who doesn't let good men die." She freed Mendes next, then Jang, handing each of them a sidearm scavenged from fallen guards. "Questions later," she said. "Right now we move." They fell in line without hesitation, training overriding confusion. Ghost led them through the shadows, every route already mapped in her mind. She had cut this path carefully, eliminating guards where needed, leaving gaps where she could. They reached the outer courtyard before the first alarm finally went up. "Run!" Ghost snapped. Gunfire erupted behind them, tracer rounds stitching the night as Kazmi's men realized what was happening. Ghost turned, dropping to one knee, firing controlled bursts to keep the pursuit pinned down. Wilson helped Stevens over the wall first, then Mendes, then Jang. Ghost climbed last, feeling the rungs shake under her hands as rounds hit the wall below. She was halfway up when floodlights blazed on, bathing the courtyard in white. "Ghost!" The voice was deep, accented, and carried authority. Kazmi stood in the center of the courtyard, flanked by fighters. In his hand was a small black box with a red trigger. "You can run," he called, "but the western slope is mined. One press and your friends die anyway." Ghost paused, one hand gripping the top of the wall. He was bluffing. She had observed the compound for 12 hours. There had been no time to place explosives after she demanded the delay. But the SEALs didn't know that, and hesitation could cost them their window. "What do you want?" she called back. "You," Kazmi said simply. "Surrender and I'll let them go." His tone was calm, confident. Ghost's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't bargain with terrorists." In one motion, she drew her Glock with her free hand and fired 3 rapid shots. The first hit Kazmi's shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second struck his hand, the detonator flying. The third shattered his knee, dropping him to the ground. The courtyard erupted in gunfire as Ghost vaulted the wall and dropped to the other side. "Move," she shouted, sprinting to where the SEALs waited in cover. He was bluffing, no mines. They didn't hesitate. Together, the 5 of them raced through the dark toward the ravine Ghost had scouted as an escape route. Behind them, engines roared as vehicles deployed from the compound. "They'll be on us in minutes," Wilson said between breaths. "Then we split," Ghost replied, checking her watch. "That's insane," Stephen snapped. "We stay together." "Not this time," Ghost said flatly. "Your job is to live. Mine is to finish this." They stared at her, confusion and something like respect warring in their faces. "What are you finishing?" Zhang asked. "Something that started in Moscow, 1986, Ghost said, handing Stevens a slip of paper with a secure number. "When you reach safety, call this man. Tell him everything I've told you." "And you?" Wilson asked. "I'm going after the man who set this up," Ghost said, checking her magazines one last time. "Daniel Foster is on his way to a forward operating base 30 kilometers east of here. He's carrying a bioweapon. If I don't stop him, all of this was for nothing." "You're outnumbered, outgunned," Stevens began. Ghost gave him a thin smile. "Not for the first time." She turned east, disappearing into the mountains. Behind her, the SEALs watched for a long moment before heading toward the cache she had prepared for them. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the truth. They might never see her again. The mountains swallowed Ghost whole. The night was quiet again, except for the sound of her boots on loose rock. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, but her mind was clear. The rescue was over. The real mission was about to begin. What do you feel when the man who betrayed you is finally within reach? Ghost lay prone on a rocky outcrop, her cheek pressed against the rifle stock, eyes fixed on the convoy winding its way up the dirt road below. Through her scope, she saw the lead vehicle's tires kicking up dust in the pale pre-dawn light. The second vehicle was armored, likely carrying Foster, followed by a third with mounted guns. 3 trucks, 9, maybe 10 men. She exhaled slowly, letting her breathing fall into the rhythm she'd learned years ago, the rhythm that made her heart beat like a metronome, steady, calm. The crosshairs rested on the driver of the lead truck. 1 shot would take him down, 2 more would trap the convoy. But killing Foster wasn't the mission. Killing him would be easy. Proving what he had done would take everything she had left. Ghost pulled back from the scope, her gloved hands resting on the rocks. 7 years ago, Foster had been her handler, the man who had recruited her, trained her, sent her on missions that didn't exist on paper. And then Moscow happened. The memory flashed across her mind like lightning, the target falling from the window, the blood on her hands, the order that had gone wrong. When the dust settled, Foster hadn't protected her. He had burned her. "Asset compromised," he'd written in the report. And just like that, Elizabeth Reynolds was erased. Now he was here, using her SEAL team as bait, resurrecting Crimson Eagle to draw her out of hiding. He had wanted her back in the game. He had gotten his wish. Ghost's finger brushed the trigger, then moved away. No, not yet. Instead, she pulled a small device from her pack, a tracker interceptor Harrison had given her long ago, and aimed it at the armored vehicle. A soft chirp confirmed the beacon was live. She let the convoy pass, then began shadowing them through the high ground, keeping just enough distance to stay unseen. Hours passed this way, the sun climbing higher, the heat beginning to press down. Ghost's lips cracked from the dry air, sweat soaking into her collar, but she kept moving. Her body had long ago learned how to turn pain into background noise. By late afternoon, the convoy reached an abandoned Soviet-era airfield. Ghost went still, studying the place through her binoculars. It was perfect for a handoff. 1 way in, 1 way out, open ground that would make any approach a killing zone. She crawled forward until she was just within rifle range. Through the scope she finally saw him. Daniel Foster. He had aged, more lines around the eyes, more gray in his hair, but the arrogance was the same. He stepped out of the armored vehicle like a man who owned the ground under his feet, giving clipped orders to the men around him. Ghost watched him for a long time, her breath steady, her pulse slow. This was the man who had ended her life once. This was the man who had forced her to bury Elizabeth Reynolds. But Ghost was still here. And tonight, She was going to make him look her in the eye before she decided what came next. Inside the compound, Foster was busy. Ghost could read his body language as easily as she once read classified files. He was preparing for a transfer. The bioweapon crate was being moved from the armored vehicle into a hangar where a small twin-engine plane waited. Her mind worked quickly, piecing together options. She could take the shot now, destroy the crate before it left the ground. But if she did, the conspiracy behind Crimson Eagle would vanish with him. There would be no proof, no justice, just another shadow war, another body in the dirt. She pulled back from the scope, her heart beginning to pound harder. This wasn't a mission anymore. This was a reckoning. And reckoning required witnesses. Night came quickly in the desert, the temperature dropping as darkness fell. Ghost slipped down from the ridge and circled the airfield, keeping low. She moved like water, silent, flowing, unstoppable. One by one she eliminated the perimeter guards. Not loud kills, not messy ones. Quiet, efficient. Every step brought her closer to the hangar. Inside, Foster was speaking to someone over secure comms. "Delivery window is 0300, he said. "Payload will be in place by dawn." Ghost crept closer, hugging the shadows, until she was near enough to hear the soft hum of the aircraft engines. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the dry night air, sharp in her nose. When she was 10 meters from the hangar door, she stopped. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear but from something heavier. She could end it here. She could take him down, stop the plane, destroy the bioweapon. And no one would ever know the cost. But some part of her, maybe the last piece of Katherine Morgan, whispered that the truth mattered. That someone had to see what had been done in the shadows. Ghost slid the small body cam into place on her vest, activated the encrypted uplink to Harrison. "This is Ghost," she whispered. "Live feed active, witness everything." The green light blinked twice. She rose to her feet, stepped into the open hangar doorway, and leveled her rifle. "Hello, Foster." He spun, shock flashing across his face. Then slowly, that old smirk returned. "I was wondering when you'd come out of hiding." "Step away from the crate," she said, her voice flat. "You won't shoot me," he said confidently, hands spreading in mock surrender. "You need me alive." "Don't test that theory." Foster's eyes narrowed. "You could have stayed gone, Ghost, but you didn't. You came back. You always come back." "This ends tonight." "Does it?" His voice was almost pitying. "You think this is about you. You think I did all this just to draw you out." He nodded toward the crate. "This is bigger than you, bigger than me. You kill me, someone else takes my place. You destroy that payload, we build another. The world doesn't care who does the dirty work, Ghost. They just want it done." Ghost's finger tightened on the trigger. For a moment, the hangar was utterly silent. Then she exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. "You're right," she said softly. "The world doesn't care." And then she shot the radio on his hip, shattering it. The sudden report made everyone flinch. Ghost stepped forward, closing the distance until she was face to face with him. "I care," she said, just loud enough for the body cam to catch. And then she struck him across the jaw with the rifle stock, dropping him to the ground. Chaos erupted. Foster's men lunged for their weapons, but Ghost was already moving, rolling behind cover as bullets tore through the hangar wall. She returned fire in short, surgical bursts, dropping two before the rest scrambled for better positions. Grenades clattered across the floor. Ghost dove, using the blast wave to propel herself behind a fuel drum. She was running out of time. The plane was still idling. Any second the pilot would try to take off. Ghost sighted through the scope one last time and fired, one perfect shot into the engine block. The aircraft went silent. No escape now. She turned her fire back on the men closing in, moving like a dancer, a step left, a shot, a step right, a reload, until the last of them fell. When the silence finally returned, Foster was still on the ground, blood running from his mouth, his eyes burning with fury. Ghost crouched beside him. "You're coming with me," she said. "You'll never make it out alive." Ghost smiled faintly. "That's not the plan." She zip-tied his hands and dragged him toward the edge of the airfield, where she had hidden her exit bike hours earlier. Behind her, the hangar still smelled of cordite and fuel, smoke curling into the night sky. Ahead, the mountains waited. And somewhere far away, the SEALs would soon know the truth. How far can you carry the man who ruined your life before you let him go? Ghost half-dragged, half-shoved Foster toward the waiting dirt bike. His wrists were zip-tied behind his back, but his mouth hadn't stopped working since she'd taken him down. "You're wasting time," he hissed. "They'll already be mobilizing." She ignored him, slinging her rifle across her back and starting the bike with a kick. "We're not going to make it out." She cut him off by jamming him onto the seat behind her, then gunning the throttle. The engine roared, shattering the quiet. The bike tore across the scrubland, the icy wind burning her face. Behind her, Foster gripped the frame with bound hands, trying not to fall. Within minutes, headlights appeared in the distance, pursuit vehicles. Of course they were coming. Ghost swerved off the main track, plunging into the Badlands where no truck could follow at speed. Rocks hammered against the bike's undercarriage, the suspension groaning as she pushed it harder than it was ever meant to go. Her body ached, every muscle screaming, but she didn't slow. "Where are you even taking me?" Foster shouted over the engine noise. "Someplace where someone will listen," Ghost said, her voice flat. "You think Harrison can save you? He can't. No one can. When they find you, they'll erase you for good this time." "Then they'd better be fast," she said grimly, "because I'm not done talking yet." By dawn, the bike's engine was sputtering. Ghost ditched it near a dried-out riverbed, pulling Foster to his feet. "We walk from here," she said. He stumbled, cursing, his boots sliding on loose rock. Ghost kept moving, checking her watch. They had 6 hours to reach the extraction point Harrison had designated on the encrypted channel. 6 hours to cross 12 kilometers of hostile terrain. And they were being hunted. Through the scope of her rifle, she could see the pursuit team on the ridge a kilometer back, fanning out to cut off escape routes. "Pick up the pace," she said, shoving Foster forward. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he said. "Not yet. You think this ends with me. It doesn't. Crimson Eagle wasn't my idea, Ghost. It was sanctioned. I was just the one willing to get my hands dirty." She didn't answer. If she did, she might pull the trigger now. By mid-morning, the sun was high, the heat brutal. Ghost's canteen was almost empty. She spared a swallow for herself and tossed the rest at Foster. He drank greedily, then looked at her with something like curiosity. "Why do you even care what happens to them?" he asked finally. "The SEALs." "Yes, 4 men, operators, they knew the risks." Ghost stopped walking, turned, and leveled her rifle at him. "They were good men," she said softly, "and you tried to use them as pawns. You wanted their deaths to pull me back. Well, congratulations, Foster, you got me. Now I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what you did." His smile was thin and cruel. "You think the world wants to know? You think anyone outside the two of us cares? They want their wars clean, Ghost. They want their headlines simple. Good guys, bad guys, not women like you who live in the gray." Then maybe it's time they learned the truth. A crack echoed through the canyon. Ghost dropped instinctively, dragging Foster down with her. The bullet hit the rock where her head had been a second ago, sending shards flying. "Sniper," she muttered, pulling Foster into cover. She scanned the ridgeline, spotted the glint and fired. One shot, then silence. But more were coming. She could hear engines in the distance now, trucks grinding their way through the ravine. She grabbed Foster by the collar and hauled him upright. Move! The next 2 hours were a blur of running, fighting, and hiding. Ghost used every trick she knew, doubling back, setting up false trails, laying small traps to slow the pursuit. But every time she thought they had shaken them, new shapes appeared on the horizon. By early afternoon, Ghost's arms trembled with exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since the day before. Her body was running on adrenaline alone. Foster stumbled behind her, his boots bloodied from the rough ground. Finally, he collapsed against a rock. "You can kill me now," he panted, "because this is where I stop." Ghost crouched in front of him, sweat running down her face. "You don't get to stop," she said. "Not until I decide you've paid enough." Her radio crackled softly in her ear, Harrison's voice. "Ghost, you're late. Extraction bird won't hold the LZ past 1400. What's your status?" "2 clicks out," she said. "We're coming in hot." "Understood. Be advised we've intercepted chatter. They're closing in." "They've been closing in all morning," she said, pulling Foster to his feet again. "Ghost." "Save it," she snapped, cutting the line. This was her fight now. The last kilometer was a nightmare. Bullets snapped past them from the ridges, forcing Ghost to lay down, covering fire every 20 meters. By the time they reached the LZ, smoke was rising in the distance. The compound they'd left behind, perhaps, or another fight entirely. The extraction helo was circling low, its rotors kicking up dust. Ghost shoved Foster ahead of her, sprinting the last stretch, her chest on fire from the effort. The crew chief leaned out, shouting over the roar. "Move, move, we've got 30 seconds. Ghost practically threw Foster into the cargo bay, then turned, her rifle barking at the ridge as Casmi's men appeared, opening fire. Rounds tore into the dirt near her feet, splintered the frame of the helicopter. "Go!" the crew chief screamed. Ghost dove inside as the helo lifted off, still firing through the open door. She saw Casmi's men shrink below them, still firing, still screaming. Then the ground fell away, and the desert spread out beneath them like a dead ocean. Ghost slumped against the bulkhead, chest heaving, blood running from a shallow graze on her arm. Across from her, Foster sat cuffed to the bench, watching her. "You think you've won," he said finally. Ghost didn't look at him. "This isn't about winning," she said. "Then what is it about?" She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "It's about telling the truth." They reached the forward operating base an hour later. Harrison was waiting on the tarmac. When Ghost stepped out of the helo, he studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, the closest thing to approval he ever gave. "You did it," he said. "Not yet," she replied, gesturing toward Foster as the MPs dragged him out of the aircraft. "He talks," she said, "on record or this never ends." Harrison's expression hardened. "That's not my call." "Then find out whose it is," Ghost said, stepping past him. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might see the look on Foster's face, the faint, knowing smile of a man who still thought he was in control. And that might be the thing that finally broke her. What happens after the fight is over? The base was quiet that night, unnervingly so. The kind of quiet that followed after too much blood had been spilled. Ghost sat alone on a folding chair outside the interrogation hut, the desert wind lifting strands of hair from her face. Her rifle leaned against her knee, her gloves discarded on the sand. Inside, Daniel Foster was talking. For hours his voice had droned on, sometimes arrogant, sometimes defiant, sometimes unexpectedly almost pleading. He gave them names, operations, proof of the conspiracy to resurrect Crimson Eagle. And through it all, Ghost sat outside, staring at the horizon, wondering what any of it would change. "Long day," a voice said softly behind her. She turned slow and cautious. Stephen stood there, arm in a sling, a fresh line of stitches across his temple. Wilson, Mendes, and Jang stood just behind him. The SEALs looked different now, less like warriors and more like survivors. "You made it," she said quietly. "Yeah," Stephen said, stepping closer. "Thanks to you." Ghost looked away. "I just opened the door, you walked through it." "You risked your life for us," Wilson said. "You could have left us there." "I almost did," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. That seemed to surprise them too. "Why didn't you?" Mendes asked softly. Ghost looked at each of them in turn. "Because I couldn't let you be used," she said finally. "Not like I was." Stephen studied her face for a long moment. "You're not just a barber," he said. "No." "Then who are you?" For a moment she almost told them everything. Elizabeth Reynolds, CIA operative, Moscow, the burn notice. But then she remembered Harrison's warning. Some truths could get them all killed. "Someone who was tired of running," she said instead. Wilson's gaze softened. "Well, you've got friends now if you ever need us." Ghost nodded once, unable to trust her voice. The SEALs turned and walked away, their boots crunching softly in the sand, leaving her alone again. An hour later, Harrison emerged from the interrogation hut, looking older than he had that morning. "He gave us everything," he said. "Names, dates, bank accounts, enough to shut down the entire network." And that's what's going to happen," Harrison said, quietly. "No trials, no headlines, just a slow, surgical dismantling." Ghost's jaw tightened. "So the world will never know." "The world doesn't need to know," Harrison said gently. "What matters is that it stops." She stood, her chair scraping against the dirt. "I didn't go through hell just to keep this secret buried," she said. "You didn't go through hell alone," Harrison said quietly. "We've all done things the world will never know about. That's the price of keeping it safe." Ghost turned away, looking out into the night. "Maybe the world deserves to be unsafe," she said. "Careful," Harrison said softly. "That's how ghosts stay ghosts forever." Sleep didn't come. She lay on the cot in the temporary quarters they had given her, staring at the ceiling. Every scar on her body ached. Her hands still smelled faintly of cordite. And in her mind she saw Foster's face. Not during the interrogation, not during the firefight, but after, when the MPs dragged him past her. He had looked at her like he still owned her. Like even in defeat, he was certain that he had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Ghost sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. She opened the small pack she kept at the foot of the bed. Inside were the passports, the cash, the identities that could take her anywhere. It would be easy. She could be gone before dawn, across the border by noon, a ghost again by nightfall. No debriefings, no tribunals, no chains of command. No one telling her what she could or couldn't say. But then she remembered Stephen standing in the moonlight, his arm in a sling, saying thank you. And she remembered Wilson's voice, "You've got friends now." She closed the pack. For the first time in 7 years, she considered staying. Not as Ghost, not as Elizabeth Reynolds, but as herself. The next morning, Harrison found her watching the sunrise from the edge of the tarmac. "You're leaving," he said. "Not yet." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm staying for the hearing," she said. "If there's going to be one. If they're going to bury this, they can at least look me in the eye while they do it." Harrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Brave choice," he said. "No," she said quietly, "just tired of running." The helo waiting for her rumbled in the background, its rotors already spinning. "Where does this end, Ghost?" Harrison asked. She turned to him, the first hint of a smile ghosting across her lips. "Maybe it doesn't," she said. And then she walked toward the helo, her shadow stretching long across the sand. That night, Stevens found her again. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded. "Good, means you're human." Ghost let out a breath that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob. "You ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" she asked. "All the time," Stevens said. And we do it anyway," he said simply. She didn't reply. But when she finally lay down that night, she didn't reach for the pack under the cot. For the first time in a long time, she let herself stay still. How do you face the machine that once erased you? Ghost stood in the tribunal chamber, hands clasped loosely behind her back. The room was cold, sterile, lit by the harsh white glow of overhead fluorescents. 3 officers sat at the table in front of her, a colonel, a State Department official, and a man in a suit who didn't introduce himself but didn't need to. CIA. Harrison stood against the wall, silent, arms folded. On the far end of the room sat the SEALs. They weren't required to be here. They came anyway. Ghost met Stevens' eyes briefly before the questioning began. "Elizabeth Reynolds," the colonel said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Former agency asset declared compromised in 1986. Officially, you no longer exist. And yet here you are, in possession of highly classified intelligence and an unregistered prisoner. Would you care to explain?" Ghost didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to explain," she said. "I came here so you could hear the truth." The man in the suit leaned forward. "Which is?" "That Daniel Foster used an active SEAL team as bait to resurrect Operation Crimson Eagle. That he attempted to deliver a bioweapon to insurgent forces in exchange for destabilizing leverage. And that if I hadn't intervened, 4 of your operators would be dead right now, on live broadcast." Her voice was calm, steady, but her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You can bury that if you want. You can call it classified, say it never happened, but you can't pretend you didn't hear it." Silence filled the room, thick as smoke. Finally, the colonel spoke. "Foster has corroborated portions of your account. The operation was indeed rogue. He will face charges, quietly." Ghost's jaw tightened. "Quietly, of course." "This isn't about hiding the truth," the State Department official said gently. "It's about preventing a global incident. The public doesn't need to know about Crimson Eagle." Ghost let out a breath through her nose, her eyes hard. "No," she said softly, "but I needed to know that you knew, that someone still believed the truth mattered." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man in the suit closed the file in front of him. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You can stay here and work with us, debrief, testify, help us clean up what's left of this network, or you can walk out that door and disappear again. If you choose the second option, we will not follow you. But if you choose the first—" His eyes met hers. "You don't get to be a ghost anymore." The offer hung in the air long after the room had emptied. Outside, the desert wind blew across the tarmac, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and hot sand. Ghost stood alone by the hangar, staring at the horizon as the sun began to set. This was the moment she had been running from for 7 years. Katherine Morgan's life waited on one side of that choice. Elizabeth Reynolds's shadow waited on the other. The sound of boots crunching on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. "You okay?" Stevens asked, stepping up beside her. She shrugged. "Define okay." He smiled faintly. "You could stay. We could use someone like you." Ghost looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since Moscow, she let someone see all of it, the weight, the fear, the stubborn ember of hope that had survived everything. "I don't know if I belong anywhere anymore," she said. "Maybe that's the point," Stevens replied. "Maybe belonging isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you choose." Ghost didn't answer right away. She watched the last light bleed out of the sky, the stars beginning to emerge one by one. Then she smiled, small, quiet but real. "Tell your men I said goodbye," she said finally. Stevens frowned. "You're leaving." "For now." He nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing else. "Take care of yourself, Ghost." She shook her head. "Not Ghost." He waited. "Katherine," she said softly. And then she walked toward the airstrip where an unmarked jeep waited, her shadow long and thin in the twilight. The desert stretched out before her like a blank page. She drove until the base lights were only aglow on the horizon behind her. At the first ridge, she pulled over, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The world was silent here, vast and endless. She stood alone under the stars, breathing it all in. The fight was over. But somewhere out there, new battles were already waiting. And maybe, just maybe, she would be there to meet them. Not as a ghost, not as an asset, but as someone who finally understood who she was. She pulled the small body cam from her vest, stared at its blinking green light, and crushed it under her boot. Some things were never meant to be kept. Some truths didn't need to be written down. And some dignity didn't need to speak. It simply acted. "Ghost, no." Katherine climbed back into the Jeep, turned the key, and drove into the night. The desert swallowed her whole. But this time she wasn't running. This time she was free.